Shut up and sit down.
Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. For a little while I've been promising / threatening to do a video on in-house movements, what's the big deal and what I think about it. Well, now's the time. In trying to come up with this, I did a huge amount of research only to stumble upon an article which basically had pretty much everything I wanted to say in it, and it was on the watchesbyxjx.com website. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes below. So I will give them credit for all the facts that, or at least a lot of the facts I'm going to sort of rely upon in this article. Very important, I own all the blame for any mistakes. Okay, watches are a luxury good. They have been for at least 30 or 40 years, ever since the quartz crisis and everything collapsed, and then watches re-emerged as goods with considerable positional power. They say a lot about us to the people around us, about who we are, our values, our spending power, and hence our success. That's inherent in being a watch, it's inherent in being a luxury good, and it's probably the key to the survival of the Swiss watch industry at all. There's actually a name, a term for that kind of good and that kind of spending, and it's called conspicuous consumption. So it's the spending of money in a way which is easily seen and understood by other people so that they know you've made it. And that's really been the role of watches for quite some time. However, this concept of conspicuous consumption doesn't really work for an in-house movement, because the only people who know that a watch has an in-house movement is really us watch geeks. Outside of us, no one really understands that, you know, a Rolex or a Seiko or you know, an FP Journe even has an in-house movement. That is something unique to us that only we will really understand. And so what is it that makes this important? And what's even more interesting is, over the 400 odd years of the watchmaking history, in-house movements have only been a thing for maybe the last 25 years. So again, what's going on? What's driven this? And so that's really the first part I'm going to look at in this video. Very briefly, I'll explore what actually constitutes an in-house movement. There's one very simple explanation. An in-house movement is a movement made within the facilities of the brand. Now, if that brand is a small player like Morris Grossman or FP Journe, then it's relatively easy to understand what that means. A small organisation, somewhere between 3 and 50 odd employees, they all work in a single office or in a single factory, and in that factory there's a couple of people who make watch movements. Done. In-house, defined. What does that mean though when we expand out from 50 people and we start talking multi-billion-dollar global groups? When we start talking Swatch and LVMH and Richemont and Rolex and Seiko and Citizen. What does in-house mean? These companies they're broken up into multiple little subordinate organizations, each with their own budget lines, each with their own independent facilities, each with their own CEOs. They're moved around because these big groups want to minimize their tax. They want to be able to move IP into places it can be easily exploited or best protected. They want to be able to break groups up to minimize the impact of labor laws on them. So there's all these things that drive these big groups to atomize themselves into smaller groups that act largely independently of each other. So what does it mean in that environment to say that something is in-house? I'm not sure. I think we broadly would say it comes from the group, but then the groups often break themselves up and don't use consistent namings. So if you're a company like Rolex, then it's relatively easy because at least the name Rolex turns up in every part of the group. If you're Seiko, the name Seiko turns up in every part of the group. But if you're LVMH or Richemont, then that's not true. They have multiple brands for what they sell. And so even though everything is owned by one company, the way that company is structured means that what would be in-house in one group isn't in-house in another group, which makes zero sense. And so after about 2 weeks of trying to research and find someone somewhere that had a definition of in-house that made sense in these large corporate groupings, I simply gave it up as a fool's errand. I could not find one definition anywhere on the net that could be applied in good faith universally and at all times. It was always the definition works well for this company, but when we apply it here it doesn't work, so we have to use something else. That to me means that there is no definition. That in a way though isn't a problem. It actually makes this idea of, well, if we don't even know what it is and yet it's so important, what the hell is going on with in-house and why is it such a big thing? Well, whatever it is that makes the idea of in-house a big thing, it certainly isn't history. As I said, for 400 years or so, the Swiss watch industry and the watch industry worldwide, because if we go back far enough to the Germans and the French and the English, even then the concept of in-house was no big deal. Back then it was the norm was to have specialist case makers and specialist dial makers and specialist hand makers, specialist crown makers of all things, and yes, specialist movement makers. And they would make movements for many brands. They would make hands for many brands. They would make crowns for many brands. And then the job of the brand was to bring those things together and sell you something that was well made or well designed or particularly interesting. But then sometime around the mid-1990s, everything changed. Suddenly it wasn't good enough that you were using an ETA movement. Suddenly it became important that something was in-house. And that's really interesting. So now let's talk about, normally when something like this was to change, we'd look at something like our old friend, conspicuous consumption, and say it was a time when people wanted to spend more on things that would show off their wealth. But as I said before, that doesn't work for an in-house movement because most people don't know. So what is it? Now, there's an American, I think she's an American professor, Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, who's the author of a book, The Sum of Small Things, A Theory of the Aspirational Class. And she kind of came up with this new concept, not conspicuous consumption, but instead conspicuous production. Now, the theory of conspicuous production, sorry, I'm going to keep tripping over that. The theory of conspicuous production is that the value of a good is at least as much derived from how it's made as what it is, what it's made from, and where it and what it does. And in fact, in some cases, all of the value is actually in how it's made. Now, if this sounds weird, have you ever paid more for a cup of coffee from single origin beans? Have you ever sought out a local brewery that sells craft beer? Have you ever wondered or wanted to spend that little bit extra for a small vat whiskey? Have you ever gone on a winery tour and been so excited about tasting wine direct from the cellar? In every case, those are examples of conspicuous production. Those are examples of where the value of the thing you got wasn't really by how it tasted or how it smelt or the nose that it gave you, but it was about where it came from. So why did this happen? Why did conspicuous production become a thing that we cared about? It rose during those sort of early to mid 90s, and it was largely a push by two forces: a fear of globalization and the commodification that was having on all of the goods and services that we'd always sort of loved and cherished and identified with, and also a time of radically increasing transparency, where we started to get access to information, whether that was through cable news services or through this new thing called the internet. We began to get access to information that we'd never had before. So combine those two things, a fear of globalization and suddenly more transparency about the world and how it works than ever before, and we started to become really concerned about how things were made. And from that, a whole bunch of new consumer trends came about, where we started to care about things like traditional craftsmanship, origin, helping out that poor Peruvian farmer, the quality and distinctiveness of the products that went into the design that we bought, or into the product that we bought, the artisanship that was spent making it, and then the personal relationship we had with people through that journey. But because this is a capitalist society, of course that's not allowed to go unnoticed. Brands very quickly realize this. They recognize that people like you and I, and if we're spending money on watches, we are by definition affluent, and we're willing to pay more for things that have got this kind of authenticity around them. We're willing to spend more for that craft beer. We're willing to spend more for that single origin coffee, and yes, we're willing to spend more for a watch with an in-house movement. Now, you would have noticed I keep referring to a small band or a small collection of products. Part of that's because, yeah, it's just in the materials, and of course I'm going to keep going back to it. But the other part is because this where conspicuous production really took off, where it really bit, was where it was actually quite difficult to describe the differences and the qualities of a product in any other way. It's actually, have you ever tried to describe to someone why a wine tastes particularly good without sounding a bit poncy? Have you ever tried to describe to someone why coffee, a really good coffee, is a really good coffee? It's very difficult unless you're a real expert and your listener is a real expert. It's very difficult to describe things like mouthfeel and texture and nose. It's actually much easier to use words like, well, it's biodynamic and it's free and it's fair trade and it's single origin and it's small batch. Those things are easy. Those things can be readily understood, readily put on a label, and readily sold. So what's all this got to do with watches? Now let's get in our time machine again and go back to these, like the mid 1990s. Remember what was being created then, and that what was being created was the internet, and we were getting the rise of forums to talk about everything that was going on. I wasn't into watches back then. I was playing Warhammer, I think, or Warhammer 40k, and I remember being on all those text-based forums, and suddenly I went from having no community and being able to talk to essentially no one about, in my case, wargaming, but in this case we're now talking watches, suddenly being able to talk to everyone around the world. And if you listen to the old and bolds, the doyens of the watch collecting community who were in those early forum days, and they've been on a couple of podcasts on Hodinkee and Worn and Wound lately, go listen to them and they'll talk about this democratization process. How, you know, in the early 90s, watch collecting was a very lonely hobby. You probably never spoke to anyone else about a watch. You didn't know much about watches. And then suddenly Time Zone was created as a forum, and people are desperately trying to talk about their watches all the time. And one of the things that they're doing is they're sitting there and they're typing and they're describing their watches. they keep saying the same things over and over again, that they're all powered by ETA 2892 or Value 7750 movements. And it's then very difficult to do what forums are all about, which is to say why your watch is better than someone else's. I am so cynical. But it's true. So much of what we do in this world is about comparing and about making comparisons. And it's very difficult in a text-based world. Even now with images and video, it can be quite difficult to actually compare things when the things that separate them, with the aspects of the product that separates them, are kind of ephemeral. It's quite difficult. Even today, we really struggle to talk about the fine details, the fine differences between grades of polish, between grades of striping. We find it quite often cases the differences in functional performance between watches are negligible. And so if everything, once you start getting beyond a certain price point, if every watch is chronometer grade, what do you've got to talk about? And that's the easy stuff. Now let's start talking about the really hard stuff to talk about. All that arty-farty stuff like tension and comfort and congruence and proportion and harmony. Try and get your average person to talk about that stuff and say why one watch is better than another watch because of the proportions, and we're in real trouble. And finally, one last thing that has not changed from those early 90s periods to now is that the watch collecting community is continuing to grow, continuing to move into new regions, new demographics, new communities. And think about what that means. That means by definition, we've constantly got new people coming in who are immature in the hobby, who are immature in their understanding, who aren't that confident necessarily in trying to describe things that are incredibly nuanced, that are quite difficult for even an expert to describe. All in all, take all of that, put it together, and the watch world is a perfect little petri dish for the germ of the idea of conspicuous production to take hold. I might struggle. I might not be able to tell you that the curve of the line in the longitudinal run from the mid case to the end of the lug is particularly pleasing, but I can sure as shit tell you that my watch has an in-house movement. So that's all of why I can understand the desire for an in-house movement. I can understand why you would want one. There's really good reasons in wanting to differentiate your product from something else. I can kind of get that you would like to think that there's some authenticity in your watch, that there's some artisanship, there's something distinctive about it. And yet, whilst I can kind of get it, I don't feel the pull. I don't want to, which is silly because I'm that guy. Look at Instagram and it's full of artisanal coffees and craft beers and coconut bowl made just for me smoothies and so forth. That is who I am. So why is it that I'm not attracted to, and perhaps even just a little bit repelled by, most in-house movements? And I think the key here is to go back a step and remember, why did we want to do this? Why was this important to us in the first place? And it was because we wanted to preserve unique skills. We wanted something that was distinctive. We wanted to see artisanship. We wanted craftsmanship to come through. We were afraid of the commodification of all of those things through global forces, and we had insight into what was going on, and we expected more. That's what we're trying to achieve. And that's the push. That's sort of what was motivating the desire for an in-house movement. The problem is, in-house movements don't actually deliver any of that. In fact, I'd go further and say the push towards in-house movements has actually done exactly the reverse. It's given us everything we were trying to avoid by creating in-house movements. Let me run through some of this. So we wanted to get greater diversity and greater interest and greater distinctiveness, and yet at a time when we've perhaps got more in-house movements than maybe at any other time in the watchmaking community, the vast bulk of those movements are just slight variations on what's gone before. There's not a lot of innovation, not a lot of distinctiveness in any of these movements. I've got to be honest, there are some that are very good. The new Omegas that are coming out from the Swatch group, they've got some really interesting, with all the coaxial stuff, that's really interesting. LVMH group is producing, both through TAG and through Zenith and through Bulgari, are introducing some really interesting movements and technologies over there. But by and large, those are the outliers. Most of the in-house movements that we're seeing are very simple, offering almost no real benefits, maybe some longer power reserves in some cases over what we were already getting from the third-party movements. And so we're not getting all of that distinctiveness that we were kind of promised. But it's worse, because what is needed for these in-house movements is vast amounts of capital, both monetary and intellectual. The machines that make these movements are not cheap. The facilities that these machines have to go into are not cheap. And so what brands have done is they've invested huge amounts of money building these factories and buying these machines to produce these millions of new in-house movements that we desperately need, apparently. And that money has to come from somewhere. And that money, where has it come from? It's come from the design side. We've had more and more and more capital invested into producing identikit watches, and that money has come out of the parts that would be doing something interesting, that would be doing something more than just recreating heritage design after heritage design. And that kind of sucks. But what also happens is then the companies that did make that investment weaponize that by using the fact that they've got an in-house movement now, which apparently is by definition superior, to therefore beat up on and marginalize smaller brands that don't have the capital to do so. So those smaller brands that were struggling to make their way and had to rely on ETA and Sellita movements are now pushed to the boundaries, automatically demoted, purely because they're small and they can't afford to invest in this capital. Or worse, they do chase that dragon, they do try and invest, and you end up like with a company like a Turner that essentially gets driven to the wall by the desire, by being too small and over investing in being able to make an in-house movement, and from what I understand has essentially now been shelved as a active watchmaker. And I'm not really thrilled about what that means, because remember, we go back, one of the things that really drove this whole thing was a concern about globalization. And so in order to avoid globalization, we're now demanding a level of investment that can only be satisfied by global corporations, which means the independents in our sphere, not the FP Journe style independents, but the smaller producers in what I'll call mainstream entry to mid-level watches, are being driven to the periphery because they're not big enough. They don't. So the very forces that the very mechanisms we created to stymie globalization are in fact accelerating it, and we're getting less and less brands that are making it onto our radar, making it into our watch boxes. Now, some of this might actually be worth it if we were getting some of that craftsmanship and artisanal qualities and the retention of unique skills that the in-house movement was supposed to give us. That was the other promise. But the truth is, and we all know this, we're not getting that either. I've referred a number of times to those banks of CNC machines that are in fact churning out all of these new in-house movements. That's what an in-house movement is. It is a bank after bank of robotized machines punching out identical parts, being put together by humans in most cases, but that's really about it. I mean, you go to and that's kind of like the dirty little secret that no one likes to talk about. If you go to the Rolex site, for example, they'll have this magnificent picture of gold being poured from a crucible on like screen 1, and then you move to screen 2 and there'll be a bank of watchmakers assembling the parts. But what happened in the middle, that we are not allowed to know. That we are never ever shown. That's where the sausage is made, and that's the bit that we don't get to see. So in the end, I suppose that's why I don't care about in-house movements, and perhaps if I'm even harsher, I kind of don't even care for in-house movements in most senses. I fear that they drive globalization. They drive smaller, more interesting brands to the margins or even to the wall. They homogenize the watch collecting community. They divert funds away from more interesting things like design and into more boring things like capital investment. Okay, now that's a surprise. My camera overheated and I didn't discover that the file after this point was completely corrupted until the whole next day when I was editing it and had to cut the last minute or so of the video away. Where I got to was, I'm not a big fan of in-house movements for a whole bunch of reasons, and fundamentally one of them is because they kind of lie to us. They don't give us the artisanship, they don't give us the craftsmanship, they don't give us the distinctiveness that they promised. And I actually end up kind of preferring my ETAs and Sellitas. Yeah, I know that they're still just machine made. Yeah, I know that they're not that distinctive, but at the same time, I know that no one's pretending anything else. And secondly, they're cheap. So an ETA and a Sellita movement isn't taking my design money, isn't taking away the things that I would like to make a watch interesting and investing it in yet more movement in building infrastructure, frankly, in an industry which has probably got an overproduction problem anyway. So that's it. That's kind of my analysis of why in-house movements kind of became a big thing, why people want these things, and also why I don't feel that pull and why I'm not a big fan of in-house movements for their own sake. And I probably should stress that, or maybe I don't think I said this quite enough during the piece. If you're going to come up with an in-house movement that uses a whole new kind of silicon hairspring like Zenith and TAG are doing at the moment, that gets me interested. Even if you're doing something like the new coaxial, or they're not that new now, but the coaxial movements that Omega's doing, that gets me interested. So I'm not against the in-house movements per se. It's more that most of the ones we're seeing aren't those groundbreaking, really distinctive, really interesting things. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. If you hang on for a little bit, you're going to see the sting at the end, and it's going to have my Instagram and my email account. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can use either DM me through Instagram or send me an email. You'll notice I don't do wristwatch checks. If you're interested in what I'm wearing, go look at my Instagram. You'll see what's what there. Yeah, anyway, one last thing I constantly forget, please like and subscribe this video. The last couple of days on my channel have been really weird. With every time I get a subscriber, I lose a subscriber. So I don't know what I've done to offend people, but yeah, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you later. Bye.